So we can look at this from a couple of angles, but let's start with the default plain sense meaning of Israel and then ask ourselves, what does it mean for something to be of God? Well, just from the book of Galatians alone, we see Paul using this language to refer to several of gods. We see the called forth or church of God in Galatians 1:13, the Son of God in chapter 2, verse 20, the grace of God in 2:21, and the promises of God in 3:21. So the phrase of God is giving us more information about the thing it's describing. And it basically conveys that that thing either comes from God or belongs to God. It's God's called forth. It's God's grace. It's God's promises. They belong to Him. They come from Him. They are of Him, carrying His qualities, reputation, and character. So the plain sense, face value meaning of Israel of God then would mean the Jewish people or the people of Israel who belong to Him, who represent Him, who are His people, who are of Him. But of Him as opposed to what? Israel, the Jews, are God's chosen people, meaning that they're already of Him. So in what sense would any Jews not be of Him? The idea that there's an Israel that's of God implies that there's an Israel that's not of God, which again, historical Christianity would say is literal physical Israel, the Jews, whom God has now supposedly set aside temporarily or permanently rejected. But since we've seen nothing so far to indicate that we should understand Israel here to mean anything other than Israel, what could Paul be indicating by adding the phrase of God? Maybe getting some context will help. So the book of Galatians is basically Paul dealing with the issue of Gentiles who've embraced the false teaching that they need to be circumcised and to keep the Torah in order to be saved. In other words, they need to convert to Judaism, making them part of Israel. That's what circumcision and Torah keeping here represent. And this false teaching was being perpetuated upon the Gentiles by Jewish believers, the so-called Judaizers. This is the same false teaching among the believers that they had to deal with at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. That's what Paul's referring to in Galatians chapter 2 when he talks about how he went up to Jerusalem and there were those there teaching this stuff, whom he characterizes as false brothers with false pretenses, although that's not how Acts portrays them. And Paul says these Jewish believers were trying to bring the Gentiles under bondage, wanting to compel their circumcision. They were troubling the Gentiles and perverting the good news with their teaching. And Paul can't stand these guys, his own fellow Jews. In Galatians 5:12, we find him deriding them and showing his contempt for them and their teaching about circumcision, saying, "Oh, how I wish that even they who are unsettling you would just castrate themselves." He was just a wee bit perturbed. Why? Because he knew that by causing the Gentiles to embrace this teaching, they were putting the Gentiles' salvation in jeopardy. That's why he also rebuked the Galatian Gentiles in chapter 5, verse 2, telling them that if they became circumcised, Messiah would profit them nothing. And in verse 4, he says that those seeking to be declared righteous by Torah are cut off from the Messiah. So that's the overall context of the book of Galatians. The Gentiles had embraced the false teaching by the false Jewish brothers, the Judaizers, that Gentile believers had to get circumcised and keep the Torah. In other words, they were misleading the Gentiles by telling them that they needed to convert to Judaism and become part of Israel in order to be saved. And it's these Jewish believers with their false teaching who Paul condemns with his closing remarks in Galatians 6, which then gives the Israel of God some possible context. In verses 12 through 16, he says, "As many as are wanting to make a good showing in the flesh, meaning the Judaizers, these compel you Gentiles to become circumcised, only so that they may not be persecuted for the execution stake of Messiah." So the Judaizers are definitely believers, but are teaching and behaving falsely. Continuing in verse 13, "For neither do these who are themselves circumcised, the Judaizers, guard the Torah, but they want you to be circumcised so that they may take pride in your flesh. And for me, let it not be to take pride in anything except in the execution stake of our Master Yeshua, the Messiah. For neither circumcision is anything, meaning being a Jew, nor uncircumcision, being a Gentile. But what matters is being a new creation. And as many as walk by this rule, peace and loving kindness upon them and on the Israel of God. So given the context of the entire book of Galatians, as well as this immediate context leading up to Paul's blessing of the Israel of God, it's possible that by using the phrase Israel of God, Paul's actually taking a jab at the Judaizers. Because if Paul is inferring that there's an Israel that's not of God, so to speak, then that inference would be aimed at the Judaizers. Therefore, if the Israel not of God are the Judaizers, the believing Jews who teach that what matters is circumcision, then that would make the Israel that is of God the Jewish believers who walk by the rule, that what really matters is a new creation. Those Jewish believers who don't make trouble and pervert the good news for the Gentiles. And to put a fine point on it, Paul juxtaposes himself with the Judaizers, comparing their pride in circumcision to his pride in the execution stake of Messiah. And in doing this, he could be including himself in the Israel of God. Now, as I said before, Paul never explains what he means by the Israel of God. So this is just a possible explanation that makes sense of the context, as well as preserve the original, plain sense, face value meaning of Israel. But the reality is, because Paul is so nebulous about who the Israel of God is, it leaves us with nothing actionable. You can't make a doctrine out of something so ambiguous, not the least of which a doctrine that supposedly says that Gentiles are the new Israel. Nothing anywhere in the whole book of Galatians lends itself to an interpretation of the Israel of God as the church.